Welcome to Strategy Talk, where the editors of Strategy Page discuss current events with a splash of history. I'm Dan Masterson, host of Strategy Talk. With me today is the editor of Strategy Page, well-known military author and game designer Jim Dunnigan. Also joining us is the associate editor of Strategy Page, columnist and author Austin Bay.
Welcome, Austin and Jim. We're talking about Jim's massive productivity in wargaming. Today we're going to talk about two different types of war games. We're going to talk about both the political side and the what was called the monster side. But before we get to that, Jim, I wanted to talk about your feedback system a little bit. SPI did something that nobody else was doing, almost nobody else was doing in any place else, was you were asking your users or your customers, like coming from the computer industry, I call all customers users. But your customers, you were asking them for feedback every issue. What prompted that and how successful was it?
Well, it made sense. I mean, there were always from early on, there were discussions, what game to do next. And I'm a big fan of, Mr. Occam. I said, well, why don't we ask the people who buy them? And it was extremely successful. In fact, a few years on, we had a regression and a factor analysis program written in COBOL of all things on our IBM machine, which wasn't supposed to be possible, but if you ran it over the weekend, you got results. And we did a regression analysis after we'd had enough data, of the feedback, suggestions, and the games we published based upon that. And the correlation was like 0.9 something, which is unheard of. Well, not unheard of, but it's unusual. But it simply made sense. I mean, a lot of people didn't like some of the games, but most of the games were bought. Most of the games sold for each title were sold in the initial rush. So a lot of people said, well, this isn't what I was expecting. Now, that was rare. I mean, that wasn't the norm was, yeah, this is what I was looking for. And when we made a mistake, not doing what they wanted, we mentioned outgoing mail. That's what outgoing mail was part of the feedback. Feedback went both ways, and the outgoing mail was basically responding to feedback results, both the statistical data, and we had a comment section. And I sat there, and I had them separate all the ones that had written comments, and I just sit in there, and it'd take me an hour or two, each month. And I'd scribble down anything that seemed to be, pertinent, and I'd respond to that in outgoing mail, and that created a bond. In fact, a couple of times we ran a control on our system because obviously the people sending in the feedback response was only 1 or 2% of the people getting the magazine. And we wanted to see how that varied, so we basically stuck a dollar bill in these random sample of people we were sending them to say, this is a control survey. We want to see how accurate, yada yada. And we had, let's face it, war games were the hobby of the overeducated. They always were. So most people understood that, or they could ask somebody who, what the hell is was he talking about? And it was bing. It was right on. The only variations were because of age, and that made sense because there were definitely age-related differences among gamers, which we published. We had to ask that question regularly, and we tell people, all right, the kids like this, the older guys like that, yada yada. And this is one reason why we got into the monster games, because somebody, who the hell was it? Somebody else was starting it.
Yeah, it was a GDW
war game, and Berg was really
GDW started it, and
was it GDW?
Yeah, with a game on Operation Barbarossa. It's Da Nang Oostin or something like that. My German's not that good.
Well, anyway, we threw their games into our feedback. The feedback score rating wasn't just for SPI games; it was for anything that was out there. There weren't that many games in those days, and we noted that they scored very high. And I ran the analytics, the factor analysis, which is basically regression analysis, everything against everything. That's why it takes all weekend to run on the mini computer we had. And sure enough, there was a large enough group of gamers who wanted that type of game, and we started grinding them out. I mean, the technology wasn't, that difficult. It simply was a more expensive game, and we were wondering if that would really sell. And it turned out it wasn't a flash in the pan, and they became a regular, didn't dominate our catalog. But if we selected the ones, we basically feedback them. We said, do you want a monster game on this, on that? Now, a lot of them said, nah. But the ones they said, yeah, we went ahead and did. That's why we hadn't ended up with a monster game on War in the East, which was quite an effort to do.
Now, was that your first one that you did?
I mean, again, I was the designer of last resort. If nobody else could do it or finish it, and of course, one of my favorite anecdotes is one time we were really up against the wall. I forget whose game blew it. It was way behind schedule, and we needed a game real quick for an issue. And I did a game in 12 hours, and I think that was the one where you had Battle for Germany. I think it was the one where you played both sides.
Oh yes, it's just called Germany, I think. Yeah, Battle for Germany.
Whatever.
Yeah.
And it was very popular. And that had been kicking around in my head, so it wasn't done entirely from scratch. But I basically sat down and said, all right, I'll have this done by dawn. And I basically had the game designed.
Yeah.
I typed up the rules, and then I turned it over to the developers, and they had a lot of fun with it. But it was kind of a inside joke. If you're really stuck, if you got 12 hours leeway, Jim will finish it for you. I said, no, don't plan on that. But
by the way, that was so popular that there have been, and I'm going to talk about this in our next episode with you, but there have been a number of games that decision games who eventually ended up owning Strategy and Tactics and SPI. They did a deluxe version of Germany.
Yeah, they used the feedback also. They carried on with that tradition, and it served them well. And that's why they've stayed in business all these years. They're still going, as far as I know.
Yeah, they're going pretty well. They've Strategy and Tactics is doing well, and they've introduced 2 other magazines that they do.
Yeah. They basically adapted to the market. They realized there wasn't a large enough market for people willing to buy a game with a magazine. So the other games are just the magazines, and they found out there was a market for that they could get into newsstands or magazine stores. So they had a fair amount of newsstand sales. But again, the feedback works. Whoever uses it, ask the customers what they want. Now, what we did do, one exception to that, and we told people this, I says, one game, SPI game a year will be editor's choice. And that's how you got the Plot to Assassinate Hitler and Scrimmage. But we also got some great games out of it. I forget the successes here. Remember your failures because you learn more from them. But political games are something I always hope to surmount, as it were. And I did, after a fashion, at the end when I did Empires of the Middle Ages. That was a very political game, and it did very well. I think I won a big award at one point. Last year I was around, so there is a market for that, a mass market. There's obviously a government market, and that's why I was working with Andy Marshall towards the end. In fact, I turned it all over to Mark, and then he marched to Booz Allen, and he took that with him. And I would meet with Mark periodically while he was down at Booz Allen, actually, until he retired. So I guess that was all through his career, Christ, almost 20 years. And we chat, and he was basically carrying the lessons learned at SPI down to Booz Allen, and it paid off for them. They basically got to be known for somebody who did games that work, did what the customer needed. That's one reason I added in War Games Handbook, especially in editions 2 and 3. I think there were only 3 editions. The third edition's in print. And I added a larger section on government gaming, military, professional gaming, and the other other people in the business, would always refer to that. I regularly get requests for, could we reprint just this section? I said, yeah, sure. That's why, I retained rights that when the game went out of print with the regular publisher, I got the rights back and put it back in print. And I was pretty liberal in letting them, because I knew the people who were asking me. It wasn't any scam or anything like that. And it was very useful. Mike Garambone, who's now, he's big in MORS, the Military Operations Research Society, which is where a lot of the military war gamers, can gather, as it were. And that's become a very big deal. And they used that chapter, and that chapter got expanded between chapter 2, edition 2, and edition 3. In edition 3, it basically they still refer to it. I mean, it hasn't really aged out in any respect, because I talk about all different kinds of games, and I explain why manual games still have a role to play, because that's the way you do your prototype. You know what the hell works, and you know why it works, because when they get them into computer version, it's a black box. And not, again, a lot of these things get classified, and I can't really access them anymore. But I kept telling him, I says, you got to have a turn F2 key or something like that into the truth, window, where it'll tell you the algorithm that's in play that's making this decision. Now, a lot of Pentagon developers were a little leery of that, They'd rather not people see how the sausage was made, because as it turned out, Al Ream, he left the CIA. He was the head of the Warsaw Pact, the Russian division, as it were. Spoke very good Russian. Had a huge library of Russian, war books, as it were, and I got to know him well, and he said at one time I think it was the miner I think he was working with got a contract to send an expert around to basically look into the source code, the inner workings of the war games they were using. And a lot of important people in the business were eager to have Al come in, because they knew it was a problem, but they really couldn't say anything unless they had proof. Al gave them the proof. A lot of those games, I won't name names, mainly because I forgot them, but a lot of them were just bullshit. There's no other way to put it. People were faking it and basically covering up their mistakes. They felt as long as the output satisfied the customer, they were home free, and they could cash their check guilt free, as it were. But Al understood, as did Andy Marshall, that if you can't validate it, which is a term we used, as it were, it's no good. And, of course, the argument in the Pentagon gaming was, well, we're talking about future war and contemporary war. Well, I demolished that, with SPI, because they started using our games, like, what was the one, the first one we did in 1973-74, Mech War, or something like that. I forget the name. But anyway.
Mech War 77? Was that the name of it?
Might have been it. But anyway, it was then at the request of some instructors at the infantry school, of all places. And I just said, look, send me the following, manuals. I knew some of the names, the others I forgot the names and what have you. And we'll do it. And this was all unclassified, material. And they were amazed at how close it was to the classified data. And it was close enough to be realistic. And I said, look, these are manual games. You can take them behind into a secure room and add your own classified mods. Who's going to know? I'm not going to complain. And they started doing that. And at one point, they had me down. I forget where it was. I don't know if it was the infantry school. But they said, we got a problem with this one thing we modified. And I said, look, I ain't got a security clearance. I deliberately stayed away from a security clearance. It causes so many headaches if you're not in the business, as it were. And so they started passing notes back and forth, without actually exposing the classified data. And I said, oh, yeah, I wouldn't say, I see what's going on there. I said, you got to do this, fix that, or change, or play with this back and forth, et cetera, et cetera. And the problems got solved. But now, 20 years later, 30 years later, you have enough people in the military who are familiar with games, if only computerized war games, but the technology games. In fact, a large segment of the manual war gamers are still people in the military. because they find that in a pinch, as Austin pointed out when he was down with Southcom, and they needed a study of the Ecuadorian, what else was it?
We did it in 36 hours, and
exactly.
it was I use the term paper dolls, meaning that we do a manual game, usually on a piece of paper on that, and that's a long story, but Jim's right.
The bottom line is when it got up to Washington, it was better than the other models they were trying to use, and it was within 48 hours. I think the general, the sync, commented, you get a medal for that, didn't you? Commendation medal. But he was impressed, and so there you had another 4-star.
That's actually true. I got
another 4-star believer.
That wasn't it. Wasn't
his own eyes.
It wasn't. It wasn't. What is it that it's? I was just down there for I think a month of supposedly. I was down there to get a joint staff credit as a lieutenant colonel, and I was there to help actually work on an after-action report. So I was really hired as a writer, and this war breaks out, and they. Between Ecuador and Peru, and won't go through all the bizarre ways that next thing you know, I'm working with the J5 on this what's going on, how do we deal with it, come up with something that incorporates that we can use as policy, because no one has really looked at this, and there were a lot of interesting little wrinkles involved. I think I got a joint achievement medal, Joe.
Yeah.
All right.
Yeah. But again, that was speaking of that, in '77. Again, this was a signature moment. Andy Marshall had a huge, get-together, a conference, the Leesburg Conference. And I'll never forget his opening comments. He said, "You people," and he wasn't looking at me, "have never given me anything I can really use." And then he started going in about validation and what have you. And then I was the last speaker. And I basically explained what got why Andy was so enraged, as it were. And I said, "Look, guys, you've got to produce a game that has, that can be validated against reality." And I explained how you do it with existing battles, Korean War, whatever. Oh, the Arab-Israeli War. That woke a lot of people up. I says, we predicted the Arab-Israeli War. We had a game in process. And the Israelis had people down at our shop. Once the war broke out, basically, they were there before when we were developing it. They obviously were interested because that was a hot, area, as it were, the Bar-Live line. And they were amazed at how well we did without classified information. I mean, we got a few tips, from one of the guys. They couldn't really give us classified information. But when we were looking, for example, for the mobilization centers for these Israeli units in the Sinai, if there was a major thing. And so we didn't make any egregious mistakes because the guy said, well, maybe not there. They basically felt it was a very important tool, and they also realized they had war gamers, in the service, a lot of them, as it turned out, and they apparently mobilized them to do, quick gaming. They have a whole department, as it were, doing games. A lot of them are classified Israeli only, but that's where it all started. They didn't really know. They didn't really believe that was possible. And when they saw the Arab-Israeli war games with the scenario about the potential war in Sinai, they were convinced. They said, "My God!" And then they had an armor officer who was working with the Israeli UN delegation. He was pissed off he couldn't fly back and join his unit, but those are the sacrifices you make. And I lost track of him, but I expect he, rose up and stayed with the wargaming because it turned out to be a very useful tool. And they actually still had, I did find out they had problems where a lot of the people who weren't really into the wargaming said, nah, it's not going to be like that. And the wargamers were consistently right. They says, no. When you game it out, these are the problems we get into. And they've gone through several reforms, since then, even since the 2006 war with Hezbollah. And they've reorganized and retrained and what have you their troops. And that's all based upon wargaming. future wars, how they're going to be fought, and and that I think is one reason why they're kicking Iranian butt all over the place in Syria right now, because they've war gamed out. I'm hypothesizing here. They war gamed out what the Iranians can do, what they can do, et cetera, et cetera. And it's like playing chess. They're always a couple of moves ahead of the Iranians, which ticks off the Iranians no end. They are not happy with being beaten by the Israelis. Of course, they were quite happy about it before the revolution because they were allies with the Israelis. And now the damn Arabs got the Israelis, all the Semites together.
So, Jim, let's talk about a couple of your other monster games here. One of them that's right on the edge, they actually have a definition for now for what a monster game is. It has to have 1,000 counters and at least 2 maps. But one of them that you did that is in that category and is still popular is Wacht am Rhein.
Yes. All right. Now, here's the central truth about monster games. They are regular-sized games expanded. In other words, when we tested monster games, most of the testing was done by just literally taking a normal game size, board, as it were, cutting it out of the map, as it were, or marking it off, and playing out just that section to test the mechanics. We did not test the entire game. It simply was impossible. But by using that method, knowing how the mechanics work, and they were accurate, we could validate the results. It's like we had those games with the the France 40 system I invented. Well, I was invented for that operational level games, which we did, half a dozen or more games. Destruction of Army Group Center, you name it, and they were all successful because they had a validated system, and it was all on the same scale and what have you. But all those monster games were simply normal size games that were proven to work and just expanded. Now, you had to add additional factors, take into account strategic needs, because those were operational games expanded. You were linking a whole bunch of, half a dozen or more operational level games together, and you had to have a strategic system to reflect that. And that was actually the hardest part of doing the monster games. For the war in the East, we even got the computer involved because we had to work out a logistics and production system, and that went on for over a couple of years. And we basically worked out the algorithm, and then cranked it. Literally wrote all software and cranked it through the computer many times in order to get something again that could be validated, that could be tested against historical reality, and that's why that was so accurate. I mean, it's a bear to play, and I realized the only way. I know a lot of people play these games, those games solitaire. Now that's a sucker for punishment, but people didn't really think it was punishment. They were simply playing, and this is what a lot of people really wanted. They said, I got these great operational level games on the Eastern Front or whatever, especially the Eastern Front. That was the largest geographic and in terms of manpower, front in World War II. And they know that all these operations, different operation level, in effect, games were interlocked with one another. And they just wanted one big game that did it. And in addition, took care of the historical impact of logistics and casualties and what have you. And that's what War in the East did, and it did it very well. But even the large scale, the monster games, the first ones out, were basically on Civil War battles. People basically they liked the idea of a lower level, a Civil War game, where you could get into the detail, as it were, the tactics and what have you. But they wanted to do the entire battle. And for that, you needed a monster game. And that's where it all started. Now, I never spoke to the developers at some of the other ones at GDW. I assume we were all on the same page, unconsciously. Great minds think alike. Because all their games had the same characteristics as ours. They had the mechanics that could work. I mean, and some players did that. Some players, and when we mentioned that, they would simply block off a section of the map, and they were, all right, we're just going to play the asthma campaign or something like that, or Kursk. Some guys would fight Kursk on the War in the East thing, and then take the results of that and feed it into other scenarios. I mean, if you played the old monster game, you did that automatically. But that's all it was.
In fact, GDW, what they eventually did was they had a series called Europa. I don't know if you remember that. And they were producing it one game at a time, but they were all interlinked. I do not know if they finally achieved their goal of doing all of Europe. But
I think they did.
That was the goal of the Europa series, is that eventually you would have all these games that weren't linked together that you could play. Now, the one thing that's interesting about the monster games from SPI, one that you didn't directly work on, one that Berg did, was the campaign for North Africa, became known in pop culture because it was featured on the series Big Bang. One of a show about nerds, and the nerdiest thing they did was play Campaign for North Africa.
All right, that was a one-time event. I basically told Berg, not that I had to encourage him, I says, go nuts. If you can handle it, and you can basically get it down on paper, we'll do it. And they had all these logistics rules, which were critically important for North Africa. That was basically a logistics war. He who could move the supplies basically controlled the campaign. But it was so incredibly complex. Now, I always believed in simpler games, and basically I applied that to the monster games. I mean, the monster games were simply a bunch of simpler games put together with a a strategic module, in backing it up to basically respond accurately to what's happening in all your operational campaigns to reflect that you're running out of manpower or your supplies. The big decision, for example, for Germany during World War II was they didn't mobilize their like the Allies did, especially the United States, until late 1943. They finally put the economy on a war footing. That's when Speer, took over, and that drastically increased productivity and kept them in the war. The only problem they had, because they weren't using the operations research tools like we were, they could not get away from Besser, designing something, over designing it, and they always had a vulnerability when it came to logistics. They would produce, the Tiger tank and the Panther tank were obviously superior vehicles, but keeping them operational was their weak link because they broke down more often. The Sherman tank and the T-34 were both very reliable compared to the German tanks. And in fact, the Russians, they liked the Sherman, even though it was inferior in many ways to the T-34, because it was faster. It was even more reliable than the T-34. And they basically used the Sherman tank as a exploitation tank. Once the heavy armor, the KVs and the T-34s had broken through the front line, they had a couple corps, which is basically an armor division. It's a unit with 4 or 5 brigades, mostly armor. And they had everybody was on trucks or on tracks, but basically the Shermans led the way because they were blasting their way through the rear area. They weren't going to run into too many Shermans or Tigers, and the important thing is reliability and speed, and that was really the key to a lot of the exploitation of their battlefield victories, because the Germans are very good at mobilizing their reserves and plugging up holes. But if the exploitation force was so damn fast, by the time you got there, they were already deeper into your rear area. You were in deep trouble. The Germans never had a Sherman tank, and in fact, by the end of the war, once they upgraded the gun on the Sherman Firefly, the one with the long barrel, high velocity, 76 millimeter gun, and it was the British who basically pushed that. You had a tank in the hands of veteran tankers could defeat especially the Panthers, and there were several battles late in '44 where equal numbers of Shermans versus Panthers. The Germans lost because their crews were not as experienced. A lot of them were in their first battle, whereas the American tankers had survived a lot of battles. These guys knew what the hell they were doing, and their tactics were very effective because they perfected them under fire, and they just wiped the Our Revanche, I think, was one battle which is noted as a classic, repeated, in the Arab-Israeli wars, where you had the experienced the Americans in somewhat inferior armored vehicles, just slicing right through the Germans, who had, they had better equipment, but they had poorly trained or less well trained, crews and commanders. And again, that basically made clear how important the quality of the troops was. Now, SPI got started right around the time they dropped the draft, so you had an all-volunteer army, and I don't know how much war games influenced that, but I know when I was doing that project for the Army, with which Austin got exposed to, doing some games for them, I had a big argument with them over the human factor, and what have you. And the first response was, "Well, you don't have a problem with that." I says, "Yes, you do, but if you want the game to ignore that, you're paying for it. You got it." But I do it under protest. Well, my protest, was sustained, as it were. People remembered. They say, "Well, we got problems with this," and I says, "Well, the designers, they warned us that you got to basically take into account the human factor." One thing they were already doing, a lot of people had accepted this after the Volunteer Army came into play. They started with the National Training Center, which is 100% realistic, as the Russians even joked when the Cold War was over. He says, "We knew you had the best armored brigade in the Red Army, out there at the NTC, the OPFOR brigade." And they were really jealous of that. And of course, after the Cold War ended, after about a decade, they set up their own National Training Center. But the problem with the National Training Center approach is you need money. So the Chinese have actually done more with that than the Russians could, because the Russians are perennially broke and the Chinese are not. And that's the thing you have to watch when you're trying to analyze the growth in Chinese combat power. Not the number of modern tanks or modern aircraft they got, but are they letting their pilots fly enough hours, NATO standard hours, 150, 200 hours a year, and are you basically letting the tank crews, the ground combat troops, train in realistic conditions? They are doing it with the aircraft. They haven't been able to do it as much with the ground forces because they're still highly dependent upon, 2-year conscripts. They're trying to get away from that, but again, it's money. It costs money to have everybody a volunteer. In effect, the Chinese army, especially in the Russian army, their units are never fully capable because they spend half their time training up raw recruits. They lose half their people or a third of their people every year, and they lose them all at once because they have this deal where the Russians started it, where they would intake new draftees twice a year. So twice a year, you had this huge disruption where you'd lose. Most of the conscripts went into the army. So the army took the brunt of this. And they had select units which had fewer conscripts, and like the group of forces in Eastern Germany, you had fewer conscripts there, or guys who agreed to stay an extra year. You could always volunteer like that and get extra brownie points when you got out, if you wanted to get a government job or something like that. But they basically had the equivalent of an all-volunteer force in the group of forces. And that's what made those guys pretty scary. The trouble was the Russians had never solved the operational level logistics problems. And right until the end, their solutions to that was to load up that's why you saw those extra oil barrels on the backs of their tanks. Made it great for, great targets, as well, because they were not bulletproof or armor-proof. But they basically had to have enough fuel to reach the Rhine without resupply. And that was their cue. And towards the end of the war, they did war games using they have their own system of war game, correlation of forces, but they also incorporated towards the end. I know it because we constantly had people from the Russian embassy coming down, buying, all of our new games, which the FBI later told us was illegal. I says, well, only if they take them out of the country. And they kind of looked at me, said, come on, be serious. But anyway, the SPI games were classified as munitions towards the end of the Cold War. I couldn't believe that. But the FBI was serious about it, but they really couldn't stop it. Just made it more difficult for the Russians to get their SPI games. But they got them. and they copied them. And towards the end, and I heard this from Al Ream, who knew of the Russian war games experts, and all sorts of interesting anecdotes about how guys would do a new study of the correlation of forces. In other words, the wargaming of the Central Front, and as the 1980s wore on, the results kept coming back. We're not going to win. And of course, the only option was to go chemical and nuclear, and that is basically, taking a risk with the end of the world as we know it. And even the Russians weren't keen on doing that. So they were in despair, towards the end. And then, of course, at the end, 80% of the Red Army disappeared, and that was the end of that. But people now know that you can't basically expect to have success if you're just basing it on daydreams, what you hope will have happen. Reality always has a vote. In fact, they cannot vote you most of the time. And reality is only basically discovered and dealt with if you have something like a war game that is validated. And that's what the historical war games are all about.
So speaking of the Russians, in your book, The War Games Handbook, you didn't list this as one of your political games, but I put it in the category of political games, which is the game that you did called the Russian Civil War.
Oh, yes. That was fun. Russian Civil War was a chaotic situation. People were constantly changing sides. People, the histories looked to, basically portrayed as the Reds versus the Whites. Well, that's big picture. But when you get down into the grass, it's a lot more complicated. So, basically, in just historically inaccurately representing that chaos, it was almost tragicomic. It was funny. We had these purge rules and et cetera, and so people were switching sides. And Trotsky deserves credit for basically getting the army whipped into shape and what have you, the Red Army. But he was always outnumbered. But the people who really saved the day were the ones who basically made the deals. And it wasn't always Trotsky. He was fairly much of no deals. But there were people making deals to get these various factions to either bow out, to join the Red Army, or whatever. And this was the key to that game. So, yes, it was a political game, but all games are political. We tend to be blindsided by the fact that in World War II, it was unusual in that the three major powers, Britain, United States, and Russia, all agreed that the only victory they will accept is unconditional. Because the Allies, the Europeans had learned their lessons with the Germans. The end of World War II, the apparatus that basically led to World War II was still in place. The German government and what have you. They had a republic, but it didn't last. And then the Nazis came in, and it was basically a one man rule all over again, just like with the Kaiser. Hitler was about as bright as the Kaiser was when it came to military strategy. And he was basically blinded like a lot of Germans were with the easy victories. But they were won by the army, because the army, even before the Nazis, got into power, they were basically rebuilding. They were learning the lessons from World War I, which a lot of the Allies sort of, didn't pay as much attention to, since they had the victory disease, we called it. You learn, like that's the old saying, you learn more from failure than from success. But a war game allows you to do that, even if you're the victor. And there was a lot, and like I say, there was a lot of resistance in that initially when they brought us in. Andy Marshall was the only major ally I had down there. He realized it. But over the years, by the time he retired, 5 or 10 years ago, finally, after, being in office for 50 years. And then one reason they never put him on early retirement, because a lot of people realize he may be a pain in the ass, but he's an accurate pain in the ass. He'll save your bacon, even if you don't particularly want it saved. He's the doctor's visit you don't want to make, but it'll save your life. But now the United States is basically wedded to that. Now it still gets in problem with the politicians and what have you. Who say, hey, we got a big army, we should do something with it. No, you shouldn't. And that's a hard thing for, politicians to swallow, because they say we're spending all the money on the military. And if we don't use it, what's the point? The point is it's there, it's good, and the potential enemies know it. So they will not make moves, realizing that if the American troops showed up, they own the battlefield. And even if you develop some interesting, irregular warfare tactics like the Saddam Plan B did in Iraq after 2003, that will be defeated as well. And you can't do that with an army that is willing to rapidly change, adapt, and retrain. And that's what the United States was doing all through, especially from 2003 to the present, actually, because we have a handful of troops, 5,000 troops in Iraq, and they are a potent force. The Iranians want them out of there because they realize, not just as a tripwire, that if we kill a lot of Americans, the Americans will send more. No, just those Americans that are there, controlling air power, advising the Iraqis and what have you, on tactics and what have you, and training. They will be a major obstacle to any, lightning takeover of Iraq by the Iranians. So they recognize. They saw the same thing in Syria, where we were backing the Kurds, who were basically one of many large factions in Syria. But they were the ones who basically took Raqqa, the ISIL capital, and they did it the smart way with missile-armed, Hellfire-armed UAVs and basically GPS-guided artillery. And the Kurds appreciated that because they basically did city fighting, and they won with far fewer casualties than ISIL. The same thing happened in Mosul, which was basically, we had about as much involvement in the battle for Mosul as we did in Raqqa, which means minimal. But the Iraqis had bought. We wouldn't sell them missile-armed, UAVs, but they could buy them from the Chinese, and they sang the praises of the Chinese clones of the Predator and the Hellfire missile, which worked quite well because that saved a lot of lives. And because the Iraqis discovered that to really make progress in city fighting, not get bogged down in a basically mutual murder fest, they sent in their special forces, which were a limited, unit. They were only like 20 or 25,000 troops, and they really wanted to lose these guys because they were the best trained, the best, most reliable troops they had. So in order to keep the morale up and to basically not get all these guys killed off, they had to use a lot of smart bombs, which the Americans and other NATO air forces delivered. And, of course, the Iraqis were very proud of the fact that they had their own Predators with the Wulong, the Chinese UAVs with missiles. And those were used. Those strikes were called in by Iraqi ground controllers. So whenever the Iraqi special forces got into a tight spot, they would get on the horn in Arabic to their UAVs overhead. They said, "There's the target. We'll mark it." Blah blah blah, and boom, there goes the opposition, and the advance continues. Again, you only get that sort of thing if you have a well-trained force, and basically with weapons that are better than anything the enemy can counter, and that's what the combination of the precision air support and well-trained troops, makes. The Iraqis discovered it, but they obviously forgot it because by after they won the war with ISIL, they're fighting the problem of corruption in the military and basically losing the edge they once had.
So we're about time to wrap up, and we've got to talk with the current political situation and what's gone on over this summer. We've got to talk about your other two political games. We haven't talked about the origins of World War I or World War II. World War I, a lot of people don't know about. It was done for Sid Sackson book.
Yeah.
And then you did also the Canadian Civil War, but yeah. Two that stand out to me. And in fact, I was just able to get a copy of one of these games, Chicago. But mm-hmm. You did very early on in SPI's career, and even before SPI, you did a game called Up Against the Wall MFer, and then you took that and did Chicago, which was the 1968 riots.
Yeah.
What was the motivation there? And tell the listeners what it's not really about fighting the cops and the crowds. It's more about influence, right?
Exactly. The again, Man from Mars analysis of what's going on in these situations. Up Against the Wall was done for the Columbia Spectator. I was a student. I didn't graduate until 70. I was basically a part-time student throughout the 60s because I was running SPI or starting up SPI or designing games for Avalon Hill. I was otherwise engaged. But they said, could you do a game? They knew I was doing the games. In fact, some of the guys, basically behind the uprising, as we're in '68, the takeover, were war gamers and wanted to work with me on the 1914 game, Lenny Glynn. And I said, sure. I says, one condition. I says, you get to use the name I choose, and I choose Up Against the Wall, Mother, blah, blah. And they said, sure, because this is Columbia, the 60s, anything goes. And it was the influence game, because basically they were playing, and this was a little unpopular with a lot of participants, because basically it made clear that it was basically, virtue signaling and basically trying to drum up influence to change, government policy and school policy. And it didn't make a lot of people involved look very good. But I'll give them credit. They basically published it pretty much as is. They made a few changes, and then one of the guys who went on to become a politicized doctor, I forget his name, he took partial design credit. I don't know what the hell he did, but I didn't make a big deal out of it. But they let me write a designer's notes and what have you, and that all got published in the Spectator. And it was quite popular. I mean, it was easy to play. And so when he had the Chicago riots in '68, which was about the same time, I think the Chicago game came. No, it came later because it was on '68, but it was done in the early '70s, '72, I think. Yeah, so Up Against the Wall came first, and the basic concept was solid. I think anybody doing a game since then has to use that basic technology. It wasn't about, who had how many people, on the street, or how many troops, as it were, how many cops you had. It was what influence you had on basically the media. The media is always important because they basically, tell people what they think is happening. And that influences public policy. And that's what they were all trying to do. Now, the kids involved, the SDS, the Students for Democratic Society, a bunch of lefties, they understood that, because that was basically the Bolshevik playbook. And any totalitarian organization in the 20th century, that includes the religious dictatorship now ruling in Iran. And you name it, North Korea is run using those techniques. They're very effective, at least for the short run.
My dad was actually recruited by them while he was in graduate school in the 1970s, when the riots were happening on different campuses. They wanted him to come in and join their ranks. He said, "Nah, I don't think so."
Nah, because basically in the long run, it didn't mean squat. As I pointed out at the time when they asked me, in fact, Lenny Glynn called me up. I was working as a night watchman to, pay the rent, as it were, through that period, most of that period. And he called me up when I was still on duty, as it was 5 o'clock in the morning. And then he says, "Hey, Jim, guess where I am?" And I says, "No, where are you?" I says, in Kirk's office." I said, "Who's Kirk?" "Oh, yeah, the president of the university." I said, "What are you doing there?" He said, "Well, we took it over. What do you think?" I says, "I think it's spring," which it was. But anyway, that's another issue, because I think my thesis advisor, I was taking an honors history, course. Which was basically throwing me in with a bunch of, master's, students. And he had just come back from Italy, where he became an expert on Italian fascism. And we talked about what was going on with the thing in '68 at Columbia. And he basically said, it's all about pussy. I says, everybody gets hot and excited, especially the girls. And the guys just love that. But then again, I was also asked out, I guess maybe it was in '70 or something like that, to go and talk at Champaign-Urbana on war games. That was at the time, that was the center, as it were, of the computer revolution. It subsequently moved to California. But anyway, they were doing a lot of the pioneering work on user interface and intelligence systems and what have you. And I was talking with some of the radicals out there, and I says, "You realize that once they get rid of the draft, you'll have a manpower problem." And he says, "Yeah." They knew it. They understood it. The main thing that was getting all those kids into the demos was the fact that they didn't want to be drafted. I don't know. I don't think a lot of people in Washington realized that. It was very simple, very pragmatic. It wasn't ideological. He says, I don't want to go fight in Vietnam. Although Al and I did a book, Dirty Little Secrets of Vietnam. One of the things we discovered, very, very few of the people who were drafted were, sent to Vietnam as combat troops. They were almost entirely volunteers. But that got lost in the muddle, as it were. That wasn't the narrative, as they say. But the reality was that the records are still extant, and that's what we referred to. It was basically a volunteers war, and the volunteers were getting fed up with it because as the Vietnamese pointed out after the war was over, when they were told that, well, you lost every battle, and he said that was irrelevant. And they were right, because they basically admired George Washington's strategy, and his strategy was you don't have to beat them on the battlefield, you just have to keep a force in being. Now, the truth be told, again, looking at it like reality, they lost in South Vietnam, the North Vietnamese, and twice they tried to invade, across the border with tanks, a conventional invasion. The first one in 1972 was defeated because we were still supporting the South Vietnamese with air power and supplies, but not with troops. But by 1975, the political climate in America had changed, and we cut off all support for the Vietnamese. So when they came across the border a second time, and they did this in part because they realized the South Vietnamese had no more American air support, no more any support. They were short on ammunition, et cetera, et cetera. They basically, swept through and took everything. People blame that on a lot of things, but it's basically logistics. Logistics and air support. Those were the decisive factors in the 1972 invasion. They could have been the decisive factors in the 1975 invasion. And if that one had failed, I think they might have gotten straight back to the negotiating table to negotiate something. But at that point, you would have had two Vietnams, which I again point out historically. Again, this is the reality check that war games force you to adhere to, is that Vietnam had never been united before that. It had always been broken up into various little, sub-states, as it were, throughout its history. The French united it as a colony, but that really wasn't a unified country per se. But that gave the communists the idea. Well, it isn't a Vietnamese Vietnam unless it's all united under one government. The most Vietnamese would have rather had a democratic government where they could own property and the usual things. That again, showing you how the communists work. They basically promised all the things that democracy would deliver, but they didn't deliver. The farmers got their own farms for a while, then they were collectivized and they lost them. And as I pointed out to the kids up at Columbia, I says, they talked about, hey, isn't it great in the Soviet Union? I says, no, it isn't so great. Because one thing you don't realize is, one thing the Bolsheviks did, the Tsar had freed the serfs in the mid-60s, about the same time the United States, freed the slaves. Serfs was a form of slavery. But anyway, they were freed and they were allowed to own land and et cetera, et cetera. But the Soviets came in, and after experimenting with, again, letting the farmers, run their own farms and what have you, Stalin came in and basically, got rid of all that after Lenin had conveniently died. And because Lenin was willing to play with that. He was more of a student of history than Stalin was. And you had all these, but they call them kulaks. They were successful farmers. These were anathema. And from then on, Soviet agricultural productivity declined to the point where at the end of the Cold War, Russia couldn't feed itself. So this goes to show you, if you look at reality, it's very educational. But a lot of politicians, a lot of people, in general, basically get tied to ideals, or their ideal. I wouldn't call those ideals, but their own version, hypothesis of what a perfect world would be, without looking at what has really happened in other parts parts of the world where they've tried the reality they are aiming for. And so it goes. Reality isn't all that popular.
Right. Well, that's a good point for us to end up. We'll tease the next time we talk about this in 4 weeks. We're going to talk a little bit about SPIs and your forays into science fiction and fantasy, and then hit some of the greatest hits of Jim Dunnigan that we haven't mentioned yet, especially some of the ratings over on Board Game Geek. We're going to bring up and talk about some of the games that they've rated highly over there that we haven't talked about. So that's what we'll be doing next time. And until then, we'll see you.
Okay, in 2 weeks.
Bye.